We have it. Now we're continuing with the development of my model, how I developed it. And we're going to look at some important facts that we have to take into account and we're going to develop a flood model. First of all, in Amos 5, verses 7 and 9, he talks about the flood and he associates planetary phenomena with the flood in this passage. Ye who turn justice to wormwood and cast down righteousness to the earth and seek him that maketh the Pleiades and Orion. Now, Pleiades is, as we translate it here, it's, we'll get back to it later, but I believe it refers to planets. Orion, the Hebrews didn't distinguish between a star and a planet. And so it was something that reflected light, or was either the source of light or reflected it. Well, they couldn't tell the difference. And so Orion is a star with rings, or a planet with rings. It has rings on it. And we'll show that from the text of the Bible later. So it's Pleiades and Orion. And this is, I think one translation translates as 7 stars. And that would be the 7 planets that they could see, or what they could see. And turneth the shadow of death into the morning, make the day dark with night, that calleth for the waters of the sea and poureth them out over the face of the earth. I think that's the link there to the flood. Convinced that's the link to the flood. The Lord, or Jehovah, Yahweh is his name, and he that bringeth sudden destruction upon the strong, so the destruction cometh upon the fortress. Again, he's talking about destruction. And frequently the Bible uses the flood to depict God's judgment upon evil people, because it's the ultimate judgment, except for it's second only to the judgment day, I believe, in the Bible, as a symbol of judgment. The number 3 would probably be the destruction of Sodom and Gomorrah. Would probably be the 3rd most significant destruction. And so right here is the planetary phenomena. We'll get back to this later. So they were linked with the flood in some way. Next thing, in Genesis 2, verses 5 and 6, we find that there was no plant of the field was yet in the earth, and no herb of the field had yet sprung up. For Jehovah God had not caused it to rain upon the earth, so he had not caused it to rain. Now, Hebrew doesn't really have a future tense, and it's very simple language. But what we have here is, it had not occurred yet. It has a perfect and an imperfect tense, and that's about all it has on tenses. It has some participles. For Jehovah God had not caused it to rain upon the earth, so it had not been caused to rain. And apparently from the perfect tense, had not caused, and at that point still had not caused. It's probably more like a pluperfect tense. For Jehovah God had not caused it to rain upon the earth, and there was not a man to till the ground. But there went up a mist from the earth and watered the whole face of the ground. So the earth was watered by a mist. And that word mist could be a heavy dew, like fog. And so what we have is the earth is watered by different means than rain. There had not been any rain at this time, Genesis 2:5. Okay. So conditions we have now will bring rain. So I would argue then that must have been different conditions. The atmospheric conditions and other conditions were different. So we'll be laying that out and have to figure out what makes it rain and what conditions that cause it to rain. There are 2 different words for rain in these passages. In the Hebrew, they both translated rain in English, but they're different Hebrew words. And so it's possible that there was water rain for 40 days and something else rained for a longer period. So we have the rain from heaven, 150 days of that. And then we have the windows of heaven. And then we have 40 days of rain. I think these are different. Okay. The word rain is used for several different things falling in the Old Testament. Several passages, when you look at them and see it's something falling out of the sky. We could say it rained hail down. And of course, we use that word rain there as a verb. Sometimes we use it as a noun. So it's used different ways in our English language, the same way in the Hebrew. Okay. All right. There was no rainbow before the flood. We'll show why later on. And God said, this is the token of the covenant which I make between me and you and every living creature that is with you for perpetual generations. So it becomes a token. And so if it was something that had already been in existence, wouldn't be fit to be a token. So this is something new. I do set my bow, and that's the rainbow, in the cloud. It shall be for a token of the covenant between me and the earth. And it shall come to pass when I bring a cloud upon the earth that the bow shall be seen in the cloud. So the rainbow is linked with clouds. It's linked with water droplets. We'll lay that out a little bit later, what causes the rainbow. So if they didn't have rainbows before the flood, then that means they didn't have clouds. In our passage now, Genesis 12, let's look at verse 15. I will remember my covenant, which is between me and you and every living creature of all flesh, and the water shall no more become a flood to destroy all flesh. So right here we have this rainbow is a token of the covenant. It's God's way of saying, and every time we see a rainbow, we remember God promised he won't send this a flood again. Now then, this makes it very critical. If God promised not to send a flood again, but we do have local floods, what does that tell you? Well, it tells me that this is not a local flood. This is a different kind of flood than the floods we see. Otherwise, God's promise is void, and his promise is not void. So this is one reason I do not accept the idea of a local flood. Okay. Verse 16, the bow shall be in the cloud, and I will look upon it, that I may remember the everlasting covenant between God and every living creature of all flesh that is upon the earth. And God said unto Noah, this is the token of the covenant which I have established between me and all flesh that is upon the earth. This is not just a token for man, but it's a promise to the animals as well. This won't happen again. What I've done here in Genesis 6 through 9 will not happen again. But local floods do occur. In China, the Three Gorges Dam over there was in danger of breaking. And I think the rainfall slacked off a bit, but I think the dam was damaged. The word is it's been damaged. If that thing breaks, it may kill several million people because of the massive floodwaters. And so we have floods in modern times, massive floods. I've seen them. Mississippi River is flooded. Other rivers flood. And yet God promised he wouldn't send another flood. But we do have large localized floods. So I argue then that this can't be a local flood. It has to be more than a local flood. There were probably no clouds before the flood because the rainbow is in the cloud. It's associated with the cloud. It's caused by the cloud. We can see from physics and science, we can see that it's caused by the cloud itself, causes the rainbow. So there were no clouds before the flood. So something happened before the flood that's different than it is now. The conditions are different. There was no rainbow. There were no clouds. The earth was watered by a mist, probably a heavy dew. Okay. How could the rainbow be a token if it had already been in the sky? See, that's another question. All right. I snow and cold were not mentioned before the flood. Now, that doesn't mean they didn't exist, but my point is we don't have any evidence they existed before the flood. I think we're going to show from evidence from geology and other sources of evidence that the earth did not have snow and cold before the flood. I think we can show that. We'll develop that as we go through the book. Okay. Silence concerning these phenomena and prove they didn't exist, but the silence would harmonize with any model that claimed that they began during the time of the flood. My contention is that snow and ice didn't happen before the flood. The Bible doesn't mention them, and that my model has them not occurring until the time of the flood. And so this would fit my model, is what I'm saying. Now, this doesn't prove it didn't exist. Silence here in this case doesn't prove it didn't exist, but it does fit my model, the fact that they're not mentioned. Okay, that's my point. Right. Storms, earthquakes, and volcanoes are not mentioned before the flood. My model will not have them occurring before the flood. Hurricanes, earthquakes, and stuff like that will not have occurred. Thunderstorms, lightning, and so forth. Volcanoes didn't occur. That is my model, has them not occurring until the flood and thereafter. Okay. And of course, not being mentioned by the Bible fits my model. Again, I point out that silence concerning these phenomena doesn't prove it didn't exist, but the silence would harmonize with any model that claimed that they began during the time of the flood, which my model does. All right. Mountains were raised during the flood. And of course, we have no evidence mountains existed before the flood in the Bible, no biblical evidence, which my argument is mountains were raised during the flood. So that would fit my model again. In Psalm 104, verses 5 through 9, we'll read that, where it says here, who laid the foundation of the earth? Well, that's a rhetorical question. That should not be moved forever. Well, that's, of course, the Lord. Thou coverest it with the deep. The word deep is used for the oceans most of the time. You covered it with the deep as with a vesture, like a garment. The water stood above the mountains. Well, when did the water stand above the mountains? Well, that'd be during the flood. At thy rebuke, they fled. So at some point, God let the waters go off the land. That's after 150 days. At thy rebuke, they fled. At the voice of thy thunder, they hasted away. All right. Mountains then were raised. Again, back to our passage. The mountains rose, the valleys sank down. This is all during the flood, unto the place where thou hast founded for them. Thou hast set a bound that they may not pass over. These waters may not pass over again. Well, that's what we're seeing here. God promised, a token of it's the rainbow. I won't send that flood again. It won't happen again. Don't worry about this. Thou hast set a boundary that may not pass over, that they turn not again to cover the earth. So the waters of the deep covered the earth. That means the fountains of the deep, the oceans covered the earth. The waters from the oceans covered the earth. And let's go back and continue. Now then, the destruction that occurred during the flood will not be repeated. We have God's promise of that in Genesis 8, 21 through 22. And Jehovah smelled the sweet savor, that's the sacrifice that Noah offered. And Jehovah said in his heart, I will not again curse the ground anymore for man's sake. So this won't happen again. So the curse here of the ground will not happen again. Now, it may be that there's more than one curse of the ground. There may have been a curse that occurred when Adam and Eve sinned. All right, at that time, it may have happened. I think there probably was. And then we have a curse of the ground. My argument is we have another curse of the ground in Genesis 6 through 9 when the flood occurred. We'll explain how that occurred. I will not again curse the ground anymore for man's sake, for that the imagination of man's heart is evil from his youth. Neither will I again smite any more everything living as I have done. I won't do this again. Now then, he's talking about a flood. That doesn't mean that he won't curse the whole earth and destroy it with fire, 2 Peter 3 and other passages. But so there will be a time of the end of the world, end of the earth. Okay. Now let's look at verse 22. While the earth remaineth, seed time and harvest, cold and heat, summer and winter, and day and night shall not cease. So there's always going to be the seasons. The seasons are going to happen. And the seasons are useful for us for planting and harvesting. Farmers have to know the right time to plant their crops. You plant them wrong and it'll get cold and kill them. So you lose all your seed. And so it's very critical that they have the right, they have a sequence of things, and everything's going to work just right. And you'll be able to plant and sow and reap. All right. Now, let's look at some facts of nature. We've looked at things the Bible said. Now let's look at things out in nature that we see. Of course, we understand if the Bible is God's word and it's inerrant, then everything that we've laid out that the Bible says has to harmonize. Our flood model has to harmonize with the Bible. Everyone, I think, if you believe the Bible, you have to agree with that. Now, let's look at things that we see out in nature, out in the earth, and the flood model has to harmonize with them. It can't contradict what we see in nature. Well, both the earth and the moon are cratered. They have craters on them. We have craters. The craters on the earth and moon might or might not be linked with the flood. Right? They might or might not be. That's another question. However, we have ice in the craters on the moon, and that might or might not be linked with the flood. It possibly could be. There are three distinct rings of craters around the earth. The earth craters, we have the rings, 3 rings of craters that are lined up in a ring, like a row, lined up with one another. And you have these rings of craters. Seismographs have determined that these 3 rings of craters are filled with sedimentary rocks. So with seismographs, we've found these craters all over the earth, and they're filled with sedimentary rocks. And then there's another ring of craters above the lower craters. It's filled with sedimentary rocks. And there's another ring of craters, and largely filled with sedimentary rocks as well. So now that's what we run into. Now, there's sedimentary rock both above and below these 3 rings of craters. Now, if the flood caused the sedimentary rocks, and those sedimentary rocks filled the craters, and then we have more sedimentary rocks and craters on top of that, the craters had to have been occurring during the flood, if you think about it. So we have sedimentary rock, craters, sedimentary rock, craters. And so if all the sedimentary rock was laid during the flood, the craters had to occur during the flood. So our flood model takes that into account. Okay? If all of them were deposited during the flood, these craters must have been created during the flood, and their existence might give us clues to deriving a sound flood model. Okay? Now, there's extensive evidence of erosion by water. The Grand Canyon is an illustration of this. There's sedimentary rocks all over the earth, but there are some regions where there's no sedimentary rocks. We'll get to that a little bit later. Very small regions near the North Pole. Okay, so we'll see that. Mountains have sedimentary rocks on them, even on the tops of the mountains. So we have sedimentary rocks on our mountains, up near the tops of the mountains. So at the tops of the mountains even, right? The oceans have not been filled with sediment. Now think about this. Sediment runs out the rivers into the ocean. And whenever they begin to measure the ocean floor in their theories about the oceans, they assume that there will be thousands of feet of sediment on the ocean floors. Lo and behold, it's not there. And they were astounded because their model predicted it would be there, but my model doesn't predict it'll be there. All right. But the oceans have not been filled with sediment. The ocean floors are not covered with sediment. There are extensive ice caps in Greenland, Antarctica, and elsewhere. I've never flown over Antarctica, but I have flown over Greenland and looked out at the ice. I can see it, right? And there's places in the world that there's some ice. And these are the primary points, Greenland and Antarctica. But there's some up in northern Canada as well, right? There are some parts of the northern polar regions that do not have sedimentary rocks. Some parts, no sedimentary rocks. Most of the Earth has sedimentary rocks. So our model now has to take that into account. Right? My model does. The magnetic field of the Earth is not aligned with the geographic poles. One is amazed that normally the models for them should have them aligned up with the poles, but they're not. They're not aligned with the poles. Magnetic field of the Earth wanders, it's moving, doesn't stay stationary. All right. Well, my flood model, will it explain that? I believe it does. The core of the Earth, this is weird. They found now that the core of the Earth actually turns faster than the remainder of the Earth. That's amazing, okay? That the core is actually moving faster than the rest of the Earth. My model will explain how that occurs, okay? The plants and animals, and they have specimens that were frozen during the times that the fruit was ripe. And it's in the northern hemisphere, and it's be late July or early August. Neither the fruit nor the leaves of these frozen trees dropped off. They froze so quickly, their leaves and fruit didn't drop off. Now, if you get a freeze, they'll drop in a few days, and the leaves will drop. But this happened so fast, the leaves stayed on the trees, and the fruit stayed on the tree. Okay? Right. The continents float on molten rock. Right, so they're floating. So that means the density of the continents has to be less than the density of the magma that they're floating in. Okay, the molten rock. Cloud droplets condense on molecules of sulfurous gas, of sulfur. So sulfur-based gases. They collect on them. And that's how they condense into clouds. So let me ask, if there were no clouds before the flood, might be there were no sulfurous gases before the flood. So we're going to have to, you see the reasoning, we have to go through and see this, okay? Number 13, there are fossils in the sedimentary rocks in the interior of the continents. I've gone to the top of Pikes Peak in Colorado and several times, and I've walked around at the rocks and seen them. There are fossils in those rocks up at the top of Pikes Peak, if you look at them. And so we have sedimentary rocks on the Earth, interior of the continents, and go out here in Oklahoma and see fossils out on the ground. These fossils are both marine fossils, that means out of the oceans, and terrestrial, that means land fossils. Both are in the rocks. Sometimes these fossils are mixed. That is terrestrial, land-based animals, and also marine or ocean-based animals. Okay, they're mixed together. There are animal tracks in some of the sedimentary rock. Will the model explain that? I believe my model does. There are sand dunes in some of the sedimentary rocks, evidence of wind erosion. So will my model explain the wind erosion? Remember the flood. The Bible talks about a wind toward the end of the flood. So it talks about winds during the flood. All right. There are rocks called mudstones, and we'll have pictures of them in some of the sedimentary rocks. Okay. Now mudstones don't form very often. They're very rare. But they do form, and we do see them in the sedimentary rocks. And the reason the mudstone doesn't form, if we have a bunch of mud on the ground, various animals will eat the residue of the plants and animals that are in the mud, and it's no longer mud. It loses all of the materials, that is, organic materials. It has to have organic materials in it. And otherwise it becomes something like sandstone or something, shale or something else, okay? There's iridium, which is an element in and other platinum group metals in some of the sedimentary rocks and in the ice of Antarctica and Greenland. So this iridium, we'll study it later, but it's not very common on the Earth, but it is common in comets and in some of the objects from space. Okay, all right. So it's in the ice and it's in some of the layers of sedimentary rock. There's evidence of volcanic activity coincident with the deposition of sedimentary rocks. So we have volcanic ash. There's two kinds of volcanic ash. There's basalt, and that's one of the forms. So there's two kinds of volcanoes. We'll get to those a little bit later, okay? Feltic and basaltic, okay? And so, but there's evidence of this because we have ash, volcanic ash, and then sedimentary rock, and then we have sedimentary rock, and then volcanic ash, and then sedimentary rock on top of the volcanic ash. So they were deposited during the flood. If all the sedimentary rock was deposited during the flood, there's extensive. This is my model explains this. Extensive archaeological evidence that the continental shelves were inhabited by humans in the past. It's called undersea archaeology. It's a new branch of archaeology that's come about in the last 40 or 50 years. And so what they found is they found humans that were living on the continental shelves and in the past, and they found their remains as deep as 300 feet down, or maybe even deeper, on the continental shelves, which does my model explain that? And yes, it does, okay? So we have 300 feet or more below sea level. There are tektites, which are formed when objects from outer space hit the Earth's atmosphere, okay, in the sedimentary rocks, tektites. We'll come to those later. There's charcoal in the sedimentary rock, so there was some kind of fire occurred. Now, does my flood model account for a fire? Yes, it does. So there's a fire, and so we have fire occurring during the flood, or at the end of the flood. All right. Now, there are some parts of the ocean floor that have no sedimentary rocks. Interesting. So, will my model explain that? Yes, it will. Okay. There are seamounts in the various parts of the Earth. These are mountains coming out of the sea floor, and we have it'd be good if the model explained that as well. Interestingly enough, these seamounts are on the opposite side of the Earth to a crater in the Earth. So the model can explain that too. It needs to, if it explains that, that's helpful too. My model does, okay? Any questions? Now,
Marion, I got a question.
Sure.
You're talking about the charcoal that has been found in the Senate within the rocks. Is this in sporadic places around the Earth, or
no? It's generally throughout the whole Earth. It's in the upper parts of the rocks.
Okay, so those bands you were talking about, then it's found within those bands.
Yes, it's. We'll get to it later, but it's in the upper portion of the rocks.
Okay.
And so there was some kind of fire occurred, and it was pretty well worldwide over portion of the Earth itself. But there's charcoal there. Okay.
Okay.
So again, my model it does explain that. Okay. All right. Other questions? All right. Part one, methodology. You're going to explain something. You need to analyze the information, break it apart. And this is from the Greek word analusis, from luo and ana. So it's to break it into parts. All right. break it down into parts and see each part individually. We've done that here. We've laid out about 18 different things or so from the Bible, and about that many from what we see out in nature. Okay. Then we have to put those together into a coherent system and put them all together, and that's called synthesizing information. That's what we have to do. So we analyze it first and synthesize. Both of these are Greek words, analysis and synthesis, or soon thesis, to place them together. Okay. All right. The first thing done was to assemble all of as much information as possible from the scriptures. Now, as I study my scriptures, I don't claim to have discovered all the Bible says about the flood. Okay. And so there's entirely possible that I missed something, but hopefully my model will take care of anything that I might have missed. But if it doesn't, I need to refine the flood model. Okay. So I need to assemble all as much information as possible from the scriptures. That's the beginning point. And I recognize the scriptures are absolute truth and science is tentative truth. We laid that out in our first lesson. So that's our beginning point. Under no conditions would I allow science to trump, veto, or nullify any sound interpretation of the scriptures. And so whenever it comes to a conflict between the two, I'll take the scriptures every time. Okay. If there are two or more plausible interpretations of a passage of the Bible, of scriptures, then I can use science to determine which is the interpretation is most plausible. But once I've relegated my arguments to science, I think at that point it should not become a test of fellowship, because I've used information that's tentative and I can't be certain about it. So I need to be very careful about how I view that and how to use that information. Hope that's clear. Science was not used to determine any answer to a question until sound hermeneutics was first applied to the scriptures, and exhaustive search of the scriptures was made. So I sought the scriptures first, always, to go with them. All right. Now, we have what we call empirical hypotheses. That's hypotheses that can be tested, including laws and principles of science, were applied first, after the Bible, of course. And the facts of nature were then brought to bear upon the issue, and that's my procedure that I've employed. The facts of nature are given priority over science, however. Keep that in mind, as we begin with what we can see out there in the world. All right. For instance, the mountains are there. Okay. You got to explain them. The Grand Canyon is there. You got to explain it. And you may have scientific tests, the way to test stuff, but those are there and they've got to be explained. The ice caps are there. I mean, you can't just wish them away. They're there. The laws of science, now understand, nothing is truly a law, but the probability of these things being true gets up to like 99.99999%, and we just assume it's true, and we operate upon that principle, and that's a reasonable thing to do, even though we've argued that they're tentative. The laws are. There's been nothing to negate these laws. Archimedes' principle, for example, the principle of uniformity, and other laws of science principles were given priority over empirical hypotheses. So I would argue these principles first, Archimedes' principle and the principle of uniformity. And the principle of uniformity says that all throughout the whole universe, the same laws apply everywhere. It's basically what we're arguing with that. Archimedes' principle, we'll get to that later, okay? All right. Empirical hypotheses were given priority over theoretical hypotheses, right? So stuff that can be tested and has been tested, we consider it to be more certain or sure than theoretical hypotheses, okay? it's a theoretical hypothesis that the Big Bang occurred, and that's how the universe came into existence. Well, they can't test it. Why? Because they can't go back and observe it happening. Remember, empirical, you have to see it. And you can test stuff like Archimedes' principle can be tested, and Boyle's law and Charles' law and other laws of chemistry and physics can be checked and tested by experimenting. But you can't experiment about how the universe came into existence because you can't go back and reproduce it in a laboratory. You can't do that. So that's a theoretical hypothesis. I don't give near as much credence to theoretical hypotheses. I gave almost none to theoretical hypotheses. So theoretical hypotheses would be the last thing I considered, and I gave it very minor weight in my considerations. The objections then I looked at, I read and studied. I started this study of this back in 1969. Began to study this still as in 1969, and worked on it from that. Been working on it since that time. So this is the year 2020. And so what I've done is I've acquired any book that I could find that was written on the flood, including those who argued it was local flood, including some that claimed the flood didn't occur. And I've acquired a library of these. I don't claim to have all the books that have been written, but I have a bunch of them. And I've gone through the books, and even the books that claim it didn't occur, I want to answer their objections. I think that's reasonable to see if my model can answer their objections. So I've taken into account an attempt to develop a model that would answer their objections. And of course, sometimes their objections aren't rational. And I didn't worry about them if I found them to be irrational. Okay. In answering the objections, the first thing considered was conformity with the scriptures. I always go back to the scriptures. Keep that in mind. The second thing I considered was the facts of nature. You know, mountains are there, fossils are there in the rocks, sedimentary rocks are there, things of that nature. I looked at them. Then, in answering the objection, the third things I looked at were laws of science, principles of science, and reasonably verified hypotheses, empirical hypotheses. Use them, and that's the order that I did the arrangement of my considering materials. Okay. I gave less credence to empirical hypotheses and almost no credence to theoretical hypotheses because the last thing I looked at was the empirical hypotheses. In other words, hypotheses is something that hasn't been claimed to have been verified. It's a working hypothesis that they're working on, trying to figure it out. Right. So keep in mind. If they've decided it's true, they call it a law or at least a principle. Now, a model consistent with all the facts and not conflicting with the things said in the scriptures was developed. So that's what I've tried to do here. Develop a model that was consistent with the facts, first with the Bible, then with all the facts, and then with the laws of science, principles, and then last with the hypotheses. Okay. Always it has to be tested by the scriptures. And I read the writings of a number of books, and some of the ideas that I've read in various books, and I have a bunch of books, and I've studied them all, I probably picked up ideas from some other writers. I don't have any doubt I did. And so I really don't have any way of knowing who to credit. And so you need to keep in mind that what you read in my book may have been borrowed. Some of it may have been borrowed. But I found no book that takes all the positions I take. Some of the positions I take, I can't find in any book other than my book. Okay? And so some ideas were probably borrowed. I didn't intend to plagiarize anybody, but when these ideas go in my mind, I begin to have to think them through. Sometimes I came up with conclusions on my own, right? Sometimes people have talked to me about it, asked questions about it. And sometimes even a question from a 10 or 12-year-old child, sometimes will spark an idea in your mind and you can learn something. Sometimes they'll ask a simple question you hadn't even thought about. And listen to people. You need to do that. You need to be aware of that. Just because a child is in the 4th or 5th grade doesn't mean they can't ask a real important question. They may see a question that you hadn't even thought about. So that's we need to be careful how we treat people, okay, as Christians. The model was tested by presenting it to a number of people. And of course, what you're dealing with now is my 2nd edition of the book. Some friendly to the idea of a universal flood and some unfriendly to the idea. There was about 3 groups of people that tested the model. Some people that believed in the universal flood and some that believed in the flood but contended it was local. And then some that were atheist, agnostic skeptics that basically said there was no flood at all, okay? Then there's some that are atheists and agnostics that say there was a local flood, okay? So again, there's all kinds of ideas out there, and we have to deal with all of them. Okay, this occurred both before the book was printed, 1st edition, and after it was printed. Okay. On the internet, several years ago, I engaged in an informal debate. It wasn't formal, and over the internet, on the content of my book. Was able to add more information to the model. The model was refined as a result of the debate. We had a debate going, and they had agreed to debate it, and they backed out after we went through a little bit of material. I was disappointed. I was hoping they would stay with it. But I gave them too much information at first, and instead of actually going through it more systematically. Okay, that's when I decided to write the 1st chapter, this chapter we're covering now. As with any scientific model, the model is subject to modification as more information is obtained by the author. So we can modify it. So a good model can be modified and it should be willing to be modified. Now, of course, I'm not modifying anything the Bible says. And so there's no room for modification there. Although I might not have considered everything the Bible says, or I might have misinterpreted a passage of Scripture. And I'm capable of doing both those. So we need to be aware of that. Okay. Now, are there questions? Let's stop here. And what we've got here, I'm going to go back to the book in just a minute. Go to the book. Do you have any questions, anybody? All right. Now, I'm going to go to the book, and we're going to come back over here. I want you to notice that I have added to the book in the past few days, and I've done a little tweaking of this material here, but we've been through chapter 1 now. We covered chapter 1. We'll go into chapter 2 next week, 2 weeks from now. We won't have class next week now. And we'll go right on through the material in this order. Now, I have already written now factors affecting health. All right, that chapter is finished, but I probably will do some tweaking on it in the meantime. I've added some this week to that chapter. Now, the scientific method applied to my model, I've just started on it, kind of got a rough outline. I have 2 appendixes now that have been added to it. And I want to skip over to those appendixes, and I'll go to Appendix A and Appendix B and show a couple of things about them. We have a glossary of terms, references for additional study. This is some real fine books that I think are very helpful. And then I'll have a scripture index, which I will finish it when the book is finished. Can't I can't tell you what page number it's going to be on when I keep adding to the material. I'm going to add another section, I believe, of questions and places where some of the critical questions are found. All right, so we'll do that. And let me find this. Over here to Appendix A. Now, what Appendix A is, I get into the calculation of the chronology of the Septuagint. I go through the Masoretic text, which is the text from which most of our translations are translated in the Old Testament. And I go through it in chapter 11. And I calculated the year of the flood based upon the Masoretic text. I calculated the longevity of the patriarchs and how they declined after the flood. Did a mathematical analysis. I got about a probability about 0.86 or 0.87, which is pretty good, that I had the correct formula for it. And you'll see the assumptions when we get to chapter 11 that I made. I get a little math here, but I used regression. I added Canaan in there. Canaan is mentioned in Luke 3:36, but he's not mentioned in the Old Testament. In the text of Genesis 11, he's not mentioned. So I included him and injected him in there and put a reasonable calculation, recalculated it, and my probability increased that I had the correct formula. And then I went to the Masoretic, from the Masoretic text. I omitted Shem because he lived before and after the flood. It lowered the probability, so Shem probably should be in there. So I calculated several different ways and showed my calculations. Right here in this table, we have Adam, Seth, Enosh, Kenan, and we come right on down. This is the table for the pre-flood patriarchs. And so I have the flood occurring. We could get the time of Shem's birth and subtract about 100 years from that, and add 100 years, to it. You'll have the time of the flood after creation. All right. So I did this and calculated this, and I went through and calculated then the longevity of post-Diluvian patriarchs. And we took them from Shem down. We went all the way down. And I calculated the time of when they were born from biblical information. Shem, Arphaxad, Canaan, Shelah, and Eber, and Peleg, Reu, and Sarah, right on down. And we found Levi, Jacob. In my first edition of the book, I didn't have Levi. I stopped with Joseph and didn't have Levi. Well, I found later that Levi is mentioned in the Bible, and we know how long he lived, 137 years. And Kohath and Amram, we have their ages too. Aaron and Moses and Joshua. And we have David, and we can project backwards and see how old he was as well. So we take the dates of these people, and I mathematically analyzed it. We're about out of time here. I want you to see. We got a graph of it right here. That's a graph. That's a pretty good graph. It's a decaying exponential. It fits it pretty well. I took the natural log of that and calculated it, and took the logarithm natural log, assumed it was a decaying exponential, calculated these, you got the table, and I graphed it again. Well, that's pretty much a straight line. You come over here on this table and click on it, and you can get it here and take the trend line, and that's the trend that it would have if it were exactly straight line. That's pretty close to what it should be. That's pretty close. Now that's figuring in Canaan with the Masoretic text from the that's used to translate the King James American Standard. We got an 87% probability that we have the correct formula. It's pretty good. That's pretty good. And so when I put Canaan in and left out Shem, I got 85.7, which is less. So I figure Shem is is reasonable to have in there. I calculated both ways. And then I took using the Septuagint translation of the Old Testament and did it. They have a different time for these men from Arpachshad on all the way down to Abraham. And so you get the age of death and the years of the birth. The age of death is the same, but it's when they had their first child. And so we had, there's 100 years knocked off of these times here on all these in the Septuagint. It's added, it's got 100 years more. Well, I figured everything in, refigured all of this. And then I took the log of these numbers here, and it's got Shelah, it's got Cainan in it. The Septuagint has Cainan in there. And of course, Luke 3:36 has Cainan, so we know he's in there. Refigured all this. And here's my graph. It looks like a decaying exponential graph. And then when I took it to right here and did the log base, the natural log of it, lo and behold, guess what happened? The trend line is almost right on top of it. So that means I'll take the trend line off. And so what that means for us, when I figured the probability, my correlation coefficient is 0.956. Now, James, you've had a little statistics. What does that mean?
Amazing.
That is amazing. I think it is, okay? I haven't got the standard error estimate, but I need to worry about that later, okay? I'll figure that in for statistics people. If I leave Shem out, I still get 94.947% probability coefficient. That is still amazing, okay? Any comments or questions? This is mathematical. If you don't have the math background, that may be snowing you here, but anyhow, I'm not trying to do that. I'm trying to let you see what I've done. But you can click on this over here and get your, up here you get your trend line and see that's what it would be if it were a straight line. And it's ideal if it's perfect, it'd be a straight line. Now, what we run into, and I will go back to a couple of things here, and we've got about 2 minutes, and we'll be through. If I did calculations without, and I looked at Joseph. Joseph is kind of out of order. He didn't live long enough. Let's go back up and look at these men at the number of years they lived. Levi lived 137. Jacob's 147. Levi's only 110. Kohath, Levi's nephew, outlived him by 23 years. Now, what happened to Joseph that you might think would have affected his longevity? Would you say slavery and prison? Both? I would. I think Joseph's longevity is diminished by his slavery and his being in prison. So I explained it. And of course, I took the figures I had. I didn't mess with the figures, but I know he affected adversely, lowered the probability, but we still got a ridiculously high probability anyhow. So I'm not worried about it, but I'm just explaining. Joseph can be explained that would raise the probability if he lived 130 years. It would go up. I recalculated it, and it was just a slight increase, not much. Wasn't significant. Isaac lived longer, and I think I can explain why he lived longer. Now, Ishmael didn't live as long. Nahor lived considerably less. Did he die in an accident? Whatever happened, we don't know. See, he doesn't fit in the pattern. And so he doesn't fit the pattern. But Shem, and then go right on down. You can see, these are the birth years after the flood and death years after the flood. Anyhow, I just thought I'd point this out. This is all in that appendix. The next appendix, let's cover it, and then we'll be through. All right. And I'm working on it. And what I've done in it is I've given the record of the antediluvian patriarchs from Josephus, from the Samaritan Pentateuch, and from the Septuagint. All right. And so these are where got the figures for the Septuagint. All three of these agree. And I'm trying to find if there's any other sources that would agree with them. But trying to do it as scholarly as I can. Do you have questions? Then the class will be over if there are any questions. Got to fill the bibliography out and everything.
Hey, Marion. Marion.
Yes.
Hey, did you email the copy of your second book, or is it on Skype, or what's the deal?
My second book?
Yeah, the one you're using right now. Did you send that out already, or are you still
I've
working?
already sent it out to all the people in the class. Who am I speaking to?
Chris?
Who? Chris?
Yes, sir.
Okay. I'll send that out to after class tonight, right after class, to everybody.
Okay. All right.
Updated copy.
Okay.
All right.
I was looking for it, and I was just wondering what I missed.
All right. Okay. All right. Class is over. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you, sir.
Thank you.